Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Skylark Bookshop. My name is Beth Shapiro, and I'm a bookseller here at the shop. Tonight, we are thrilled to host not one, but two authors in conversation about the new novel, Annie and the Wolves by Andromeda Romano-Lax. Andromeda Romano-Lax is the author of The Spanish Bow, a New York Times editor's choice that has been translated into 11 languages, The Detour, Behave, and Plum Rains, which won the Sunburst Award for Excellence in Canadian Literature of the Fantastic, as well as numerous works of nonfiction. She is a co-founder of 49 Writers, a statewide literary organization in Alaska, and lives on a small island in British Columbia. Andromeda is joined by Juliet Grames. Juliet is the Senior Vice President, Associate Publisher at Soho Press, where she also acquires and edits the critically acclaimed Soho crime imprint. Her novel, The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna, was published by Echo HarperCollins in 2019 and has been translated into 10 languages. So without further ado, I'm happy to turn things over to Andromeda and Juliet. A warm welcome to you both from the currently frigid Show Me state.
Thank you so much, Beth and Skylark. And thank you everyone who's here tonight on a chilly Wednesday. I want to say, first of all, thank you for coming to talk about literature tonight. Thank you for joining us at this independent bookstore hosted event. And I know everyone in the audience already knows that independent bookstores are such vital cultural institutions. And the fact that they're bringing us this kind of entertainment on a snowy night in the middle of February. Thank you, Skylark. Thank you all. But most of all, thank you, Andromeda, because I think I've been waiting for 13 years to do a literary event with you, and I'm so excited to be here tonight to be able to talk to you about, we're going to be talking about this, and this is the amazing book we're going to be talking about, Annie and the Wolves. But Andromeda, I'm gonna let you cut in and say hi.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I just want to also thank Skylark Books, Bookshop, and it's such a gorgeous store. And very soon, I hope, I bought a camper at the beginning of COVID, which has been sitting unused. And as soon as possible, I am looking forward to doing a massive road trip in the United States. And this is one bookstore that I can't wait to visit in person. It's gorgeous. So thank you, Alex, and thank you, Beth, and of course, thank you, Juliet, as well. And to everyone joining us, we know how easy it is to get Zoom fatigue and how many other things you have to do at this time of night. So thank you so much. And this is going to be very special for me. I've been able to talk in my previous events with other authors. In this case, I'm talking with an author I deeply admire and also someone who has edited me. So if anything, I should be feeling a little more nervous tonight, but also excited. Thank you, Juliet.
I want to tell, so I imagine that there are people in the audience who are already your fans, Andromeda, but for the people who are either just discovering you now or they don't know how awesome your entire oeuvre is, I want to dial back a little bit and tell a sort of personal story about how I became Andromeda's fan. And this is mostly embarrassing about me, but it worked out in the end. It's a story of literary stalking that has paid great dividends to me personally. So let me tell you about, we're going to go back to, do you remember this?
I love that cover. Yeah.
I love this too. So this is a galley. It's an advanced reader's copy. It's not an actual book, but this was Andromeda's debut novel, The Spanish Bow, which came out in 2007, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it was in 2006. And I was, at this time, a tiny baby editor. I was at the point I wasn't sure, the early years in publishing, when you're a baby editor, you're not sure you're going to make it. There's like an attrition rate of like 9 out of 10 people don't make it to being an acquiring editor. And I was at Book Expo America, which is this big annual trade convention. And my boss had let me go on her pass because I didn't even have like a budget to get my own pass to this trade show. And I was walking the aisles looking at the free books they were giving away and completely overwhelmed. And I found this book. And I was like, oh,
I'm going to interject just to say this gives you a sense of Juliet's age and mine, because she's the baby in this story.
But you
This
were
is my
baby too. You were
first
baby
novel.
author. Okay.
I was a baby author. Yes,
Right,
absolutely.
up to 2 babies.
Okay, continue.
So I thought this beautiful cover, I was very attracted to it, and I picked it up and I became obsessed with this book. Now I picked up like 800 books that day. Like I could barely walk home. I was carrying so many books, but this was the book that I read it twice, front to back. It's set well, I think of the main character as sort of a Spanish Forrest Gump. It's set during a lot of important eras in Spanish history, but it kind of culminates in the years of the Civil War and World War II, and it's about a cellist. And I loved it so much. The heart of it is this friendship that's just so incredible and powerful. So I started blogging about how much I loved Andromeda. And apparently I blogged about her enough that eventually her Google search brought her to my blog. And she was very generous to me because I was a baby editor and a baby writer. And she struck up a correspondence. So
Am I allowed to say what your name was back then, or is that irrelevant?
if you want, that's fine.
Well, it's just strange because I got to know Juliet as a blogger as Moonrat. And so it was quite a while before I knew she had a real name, and it was hard to make the transition from the blogger that I followed. She had all kinds of great interviews and a real rich community. This was really back when blogs were big, and we didn't have all the other kinds of social media very active. And so those of us who loved books got really into this blog. Yeah.
I'll say what you're too classy to say. The name of my blog was Editorial Ass, because that's an abbreviation for assistant. But I just, it was like a classic.
Your username was Moonrat.
Yeah. So that's what it was. Anyway, so Andromeda was so nice, and she generously connected with me there and kept in touch with me, even though I was at fits and starts of like, oh, is my editorial career going anywhere? I'll never be a writer. Will I ever be a writer? And all along, she always said, keep going, keep trying. And flash forward a couple years later, since I had been, all this internet stalking paid out because her agent contacted me with her second book and was like, I hear you're a fan of Andromeda Romano-Lax. Would you like to consider this beautiful novel? So I did. And that was how I went on to be lucky enough to edit 3 of Andromeda's books.
And strangely enough, that second novel was set in Italy.
It was. So I think I didn't edit Annie and the Wolves because I was actually on leave when this book was published by Soho. But now that means that without any conflict of interest, I can just talk about it with you as a fan. So that's my story about Andromeda fandom. If we have time later, I want to tell you why you should read each of those backlist titles of hers. But for now, The Detour, which is set in Italy, fantastic, during World War II, about a German who is sent there to appropriate art for the Third Reich, very good. Behave, which is about, it's a novelization of a real life woman, Rosalie Rayner Watson, who was the wife of the guy who became really famous for inventing behaviorism, except maybe she actually invented it and he burned all her papers after she died. It's a mystery that Andromeda solves in fiction. And finally, Plum Rains, which is a fantastic near future speculative fiction about AI and immigration. And anyway, just read them all. But let's talk about Annie, because that's what we're here for. This is Annie and the Wolves. Andromeda, I'm going to ask you the most difficult question right up front.
Okay. Oh, actually, I'm not sure what it is.
It's, what do you tell people this book is about?
What do I tell? I tell them that it is about a modern day down on her luck historian named Ruth, who finds her life intertwined with that of her subject, Annie Oakley, in a novel that spans 150 years and allows us to look at issues like revenge and whether or not we can change the past and whether or not we should try.
Okay, that's a really good elevator pitch. And so it has no spoilers in it. And for the people who haven't read the book yet, I want us to try to honor that no spoiler thing. So you just did a fantastic job.
Okay, we're going to try for the non-spoiler version. Okay.
Well, a little bit. But in what is a really rich and complicated genre defying, is it speculative fiction? Is it a thriller? Is it literary fiction? It's all of these things. So great. I want
you know what question I thought you were going to ask me?
Yeah, I want to know.
Just so that I thought she was going to say, what do you think about the pink cover?
Well, you brought it up. What do you think about the pink cover?
Okay, so I'll leave aside the color pink, which is a real question by itself. I was thrilled that it has this photograph, because there are even people who bought this book and have not until later really looked at that photograph, which is a real photograph of Annie Oakley looking in a mirror, pointing her gun backwards, which was a trick that she actually did. And it really works well with the story once you know what the story is. And I just was listening to a podcast recently that pointed out, a historical podcast, that she would sometimes also take a knife and she could look into like a butcher knife and aim and shoot backwards.
Incredible. Okay, wait. So tell me about Annie
Yes.
Oakley though. I've read your book, so I know what I get from your book, but tell me more about this woman who I feel like, as an American, I'm vaguely aware of her. I think of guns. I think of Wild Wild West road shows, but I don't think I know more about her.
Yes, and well, I'll talk about what I first learned about her, because I'm one of those people, I had no interest in Annie Oakley at all. And then I stumbled across a footnote that talked about the fact that when she was between the ages of about 9 and 11, or 10 and 12, for 2 years as a child, she was sent away to live with a family that was supposed to educate her, that was supposed to pay her, because her poor mother couldn't afford to keep her at that point. And instead, what they did was essentially held her captive and physically abused her, possibly sexually abused her. We'll never know for sure. And so it was that little footnote piece of it, that she would only refer to them as the wolves, that drew me in. I knew she then later became, some sort of famous woman. And then as I read more about that, discovering that she really was an amazingly talented sharpshooter, that she was, here's an interesting thought, that she was perhaps really the first famous female celebrity like ever in America, that she was known so well in the US and Europe. And not for doing something burlesque or anything. It was really for her talent, so she was a showwoman, but she had this incredible talent that was fused together with her modesty and her honesty and all these other attributes that made her very popular with people. But like I said, I really came into it with just the wolves piece. That made me very curious. And then the more I knew about her and about many other challenges that she struggled with, and we can talk about some of those more, the midlife struggles that people don't know about, then I was really curious how that early episode perhaps led to her becoming the woman who she was, a woman who was really complicated, like not pro-suffrage, and yet she believed that women should be in the military, and she was willing to be the one to train them. She wrote to the president and said, give me permission and I'll train women and we'll send them out. That seems like radical feminism, but she wasn't pro-suffrage. Yeah. She looked Victorian in some ways, and yet she married well, because she married a husband, Frank Butler, who was completely willing to support her. And he had been a sharpshooter as well, famous in his day, but then he stepped back and became her manager and her greatest ally, and was willing to be this supportive spouse. And I love knowing that that's possible even in this era. So there's all these interesting things about the sort of midlife Annie, but I really started with the wolves piece, and that intrigued me.
Now, there is a Missouri connection, right, that makes this event at Skylark particularly,
Well, she's from Ohio, from Darke County, Ohio. In the same area, she would have been touring in that area. I will say, here's one thing that confuses people about Annie Oakley quite a bit. And I, as a person who didn't understand who Annie Oakley was before I started researching this book, she was in the Wild West show. And so she toured around. They were doing reenactments of the Wild West, really at a time when all that was, the frontier was closing, all that was in the past, which made it more appealing as a time to start romanticizing it. But she was not a Western woman. She was not Calamity Jane. She wasn't someone who'd been out in the gunfights. She was from Ohio, and she had a house out in New Jersey. That's where she spent most of her time. She didn't ever pretend to be a Western woman. She was only west of the Mississippi once. She made a trip out to California and didn't enjoy it. So she really was Midwestern. And if you're trying to think of what her childhood would have been like, you think more Laura Ingalls Wilder House on the Prairie, girl growing up with a bunch of sisters and impoverished parents in a log cabin until she was sent away to live with the wolves.
So this alone is fascinating, but in fact, Annie Oakley is perhaps a small percentage of this book. There's a lot of other things going on. And the modern narrative, so the main character Ruth is the one who's writing this piece about Annie Oakley that she's struggling with, and there's very, very exciting thriller-esque component to her story about discovering the truth. But again, I'm going to avoid spoilers. Ruth has her own specific traumas that are affecting her and that are making her kind of unable to actually get her life done, right? I mean, to move forward with everything.
Yeah, I don't think it's too much to say that they both have had physical accidents. They're having physical issues. They're having some mental issues that are parallel, and they both have secrets in their past. And I will say the difference with Ruth as the historian, you know, Annie is just living her life and struggling with trauma in present and past. Ruth as the historian is finding it easier to obsess on Annie than to focus on what happened in her own life, with her own family, in her own community. And so that's where the other parts of the story come in that are more thriller oriented and mystery oriented, as far as what happened to her sister, who is a piece of the story, and what is happening in this community in Minnesota where she lives now. So there's also all that happening.
So, I mean, this is a story about kind of big issues. This is a story about family secrets, is the softball way of saying revenge and
complicity.
Yeah.
As we involve family. Yeah. Complicity.
Complicity, right, of the way people prey on one another, and prevention and revisiting a past that we cannot change. Or can we change the past? I mean,
or can we? Yeah.
We change the past.
Can we change the present? Can we change the future? All those questions are valid.
I mean, but most books don't pose them. I mean, it's what's so amazing about this book. But can I just ask, this really complicated series of questions that you're asking here, where did this story come from?
Right. So this origin story has two pieces, and we've already talked about the first one, which is about the little wolves footnote. And like I said, I wasn't that much of an Annie Oakley fan, so that might have been it for me, you know. And then it just happened that around the same time, very close in time, I got a message from relatives that my father was on his deathbed in Mexico, where he had retired. I had cut off contact with him when I was 14 years old, when I found out that he had sexually abused my two sisters. And at the time that we were getting these messages from relatives who were kind of saying, it's now or never if you want to come visit. And they didn't understand why we had broken off contact, or why he had broken off contact with us once we were all in on the family secret. One of my sisters said that she was perhaps considering going on a road trip to visit him, and perhaps she would even bring a gun. And this sister and I had actually gone on road trips in the past, including hitchhiking across Mexico. It seemed like something that really could happen. And so I was struggling with what my role should be. I never considered that I should stop her. I was not concerned really about my father, about his suffering or anything. I was concerned about what would happen to her in terms of getting down to Mexico and doing something and being arrested. I speak Spanish. And so I felt like I should allow her to make whatever choice she had to make. And that I should be there as a witness, as somebody to pick up the pieces. That was my understanding at the time. And so I started coming up with a whole different version of the story that will not be clear once you read this book, because this is the original iteration of the story. The original story was going to be about a writer and a sister and a revenge scenario. That version of the story didn't work. And so I know Juliet has so kindly encouraged me to talk about my own book, but she knows what it's like to write a book that takes many, many years, and you need some distance from the autobiography to make it work. This is true with her book, The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna, which I know she was inspired to write from a very young age, but wasn't necessarily ready to write. It's the same thing with me. I was very close to this autobiographical material, and I needed some distance from it. But that story just would not leave me alone. So I had to push back on some of the autobiography. The writer character didn't work at all. The road trip didn't work. We didn't need a father in this story. But what I was still interested in was the Annie Oakley piece, and then the notion of another woman who is really using her research into Annie Oakley to deal with her own issues. When you spend a really long time writing a novel, all the things that are also happening in the culture at that time also can start feeding into the novel. So We had everything from the Me Too movement, continuing school shootings, and all those things have to do with the world of this novel, because Annie Oakley was an iconic sharpshooter, and she was somebody who trained, she said, 15,000 women to shoot. She believed in guns for self-protection. And there's just this whole issue of predation, which has never gone away. And I will say, ironically, at one point when I was really close to being done, that's when the Me Too movement was really heating up. And I thought, well, we're going to deal with all these stories. You know, Harvey Weinstein, this is all going to get worked out, and then it's going to be old. And the horrible thing is, it's not old. All these things keep repeating. So the fact that I ended up writing a story that is also about time, about, and we're not going to give away spoilers, but the different ways of looking at time, and that things do repeat. The scope of the novel got larger because I took longer to write it, with a lot of breaks. I wrote 2 books in between the first iteration and the book that you read now.
That friction of that idea of Annie Oakley as the most self-possessed, powerful, I mean, gun-toting woman who is in fact dealing every day with the consequences of her own predation, I think is such a resonant theme for me, because I think that, you know, you have this woman who's a watershed moment in our understanding of the American woman and who she can be, and her strength and her ambition and her agency, right? And in fact, that you've put together where trauma and healing and revenge all cycle around someone's subconscious, and what you can and can't change about your past. It's a really, really rich topic. And I thought it felt so resonant. I really related to it. And I've never remotely been interested in guns before, which is going to bring me to my next question.
We're going to that one.
Yeah. I want to know, because I'm a person who's afraid of guns. Like, I'm just afraid of them. And I love hearing other people who don't have that response, you know, telling me why they either understand guns better than I do, or what their pros and cons are. But where do you stand on this? Like, did you have to do a ton of gun research for this?
Thank you. So I let some people know that I was going to answer the question tonight of one research regret that I have. And that is that I did not practice shooting guns to write this book. And I still am open to the possibility. In fact, as recently as a couple weeks ago, where I live on the island, there is a gun club, and I was actually looking up how to contact them. So I'm not done with that. But I think it says something that I didn't manage to get that piece of research done, especially considering that before I was a novelist, I was what we call an immersion journalist, and I would write long form features where I would always go and do whatever the activity was that I was writing about. So if I was doing a profile of an ultra light pilot, I would go with him in the ultra light. And in this case, he let me handle the controls, which was a really bad idea because I'm really bad with mechanical things and definitely could have killed us. I went out with a whitewater kayaker, one of the most famous whitewater kayakers in Alaska, who's no longer alive, and got in an accident, hit some sweepers, got dropped into some glacial water, and he had to come rescue me. So I did those things all the time where I would get myself into trouble so I had something to write about. So you would think that in writing a novel about a famous sharpshooter, that I would have gone out and shot a few guns, especially because, and this is part of the answer to your question, I lived in Alaska for 20 years where owning guns was completely normal. I had many friends. Probably most of the people I knew actually had guns and would often go hunting. We all engaged in subsistence to some extent. We did more salmon fishing and berry picking, but a lot of friends would fill their freezer. So I had really easy opportunities to go shooting. So why did I not? I have so many different stories, and I should probably limit myself to just one because this gun control issue is so sensitive, I think. Like my character Ruth, I have a scene where Ruth's ex-fiance, he's her fiance at the time, he's moving in and he just tries to hand her a gun and it makes her uncomfortable. That's how I felt. I felt it almost as if I don't believe in past lives. I don't believe in premonitions, but that's the closest I've come to this feeling of there's something about a gun in my life or my family's life that feels very dangerous. And I've been in situations, everything from hitchhiking in Mexico, where my sister and I were riding with a customs agent who was driving a very fancy sports car that he had gotten to use for the weekend. And federales came out and had guns pointed at us. So I've had guns pointed at me in a dangerous situation.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you one other story. I've also been in a situation with a mother who has now died, but who was deep into dementia, whose brain was not working well, who believed in all kinds of conspiracies, and who was very jumpy. And she had guns in her house, and she had people coming to her door. And I felt quite sure that a really bad accident could happen. Those are just two stories, but there's a lot of other stories of people in my very own family who have been in dangerous situations with guns. And we all know that when it involves mental illness or anything else, guns are very dangerous. So I completely, cross that continuum of guns are especially part of a lot of people's lifestyle in terms of hunting, all the way to there's a lot of people who have guns who are not safe with their guns.
There's one story.
And I still wish I'd gone shooting.
Yeah. I mean, it's too late. There's one story you tell us just now, which was the one you left hanging earlier when you went to Mexico with your sister. And remember, we are right now and broadcast on Facebook, so do not, implicate yourself in a felony.
No,
but
I need to clarify that. No, my sister and I have traveled in Mexico. We never went on that trip when my father was dying.
So you didn't kill him?
No, he actually passed away on his own, and we never made the trip. And I have talked about it with her since about feelings, and that really led to the question. And so I've shared this story a couple times, and because it's not interactive, even for me, it's not as satisfying. I remember when I started this novel, I heard on a talk show, it was being discussed that revenge scenarios are almost universal. And when that's such a strong memory for me, because I heard that and I thought, no, I don't have revenge fantasies. What is that reporter talking about? And yet clearly those sort of stories were occupying my brain, because I wrote this entire novel to find out what will happen with multiple characters, not just Annie, not just Ruth, other characters in the book. What'll happen when they actually have that moment to decide? So let me just ask you, Juliet, because you're here. Do you think revenge fantasies are universal or common? Do you think they're healthy or unhealthy?
So I heard you pose this question the other night in an event. So I had pre-thought about it a little bit. I was thinking about it even when you said it at the time. I also do not have revenge fantasies. So I was like, I don't know what she's talking about. But then as a writer, I write the most, that's my revenge. I don't fantasize.
Maybe that's it.
I just have revenge.
That's a great answer. I think that is a great answer, because that's how I was able to delude myself. I think I thought, well, I don't. But then as a writer, we get to completely kind of follow the story. And I would also say as readers, we get to do that. And I think my views on this continue to evolve. And so you heard me talk about this before. But in the beginning, I thought that was all very dangerous territory. And now I think it's really healthy. And I've read psychological research that suggests it's actually very healthy to just go through the scenarios and especially imagine all the different points of view, because we need to feel heard and understood, and we need to feel there's some sense of justice, which isn't always available in the world. And so I think fiction gives us a safe space for that.
Yeah. And it also, just in general, a reminder to everyone in the audience that if you're going to date a writer, you should not be a jerk to them, just in general. Just saying that.
I agree. Good behavior is always a good idea. Yeah.
Speaking of dating writers, I want to move back to a little bit about that midlife portion of Annie Oakley's story that is not really, it's not what you think of with her, but she did have a really fascinating life. And you get to touch on, because this is when we're seeing her as a kind of the flower of her, like her professional career, but also when she's doing things like, dealing with her incredible popularity and how it's made her a target for William Randolph Hearst, for example.
Nicely said.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's my interpretation here. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about publicity. I want to talk about her marriage, because, you talk about how she did have a very strong marriage and what we know about Frank Butler. But yeah, let's start with Hearst. So tell us a little bit about what happened with Hearst, first of all, and then what did you discover about it in as a writer when you were creating it fictitiously?
Okay. So what actually happened was a series of stories ran in the William Randolph Hearst newspapers where she was accused of being a cocaine fiend and that she had stolen to fuel this habit. And as it turns out, it was most likely another woman who was just used her name. And it should have been clear to the reporters that this wasn't the real Annie Oakley, but they just went with it and they just kept putting the story in the papers. And so so she was really in control of her brand. I mean, that's another interesting thing about her. She was a really smart businesswoman, but I also think whether it was the trauma with the wolves or other things, she needed to be in control. She needed to be in control of, she made her own clothes. She prepared her own food. She was kind of fussy in some ways.
Yeah.
And I think that's just that's something we see in from someone who has built themselves back up after a trauma, that there were things she needed to control. And so at midlife, she was in a horrible train collision, which is how the book opens, which is just amazing. Two head-on train collision. Amazing that no humans died in that. But then after that, then she happened to show up in the tabloids as supposedly, a coke fiend and a thief and all these things that weren't true. And so she went after Hearst in court, and it required her 55 different lawsuits. She had to travel the country.
55?
55, yeah. And she traveled the country for 6 years. So Juliet, you've been on book tours, right? Even pre-virtual.
Wow.
She was dedicating her life to this. So she was 41 when the train accident happened and 43 when the story came out. And so while she's dealing with all the physical consequences of the train accident, she's dealing with professional challenges, including a show that might have gone on somewhere else but got canceled, and she's worrying about her brand. And now this is all what's happening in real life. And so she's going to these trials and facing all kinds of juries and having people judge her. And this is where, to me, it's really resonant with today, because over and over again, she had to tell her story. And although that particular story was not about her being physically assaulted or anything, she had to have people judging her, was this all her fault because she had a bad reputation, or she'd showed her skin too much, or, she just had to deal with people not believing her over and over again. And she had to reassert control. And her husband supported her. Frank Butler supported her. So it's actually famous in the annals of law, this series of lawsuits, which she won all but one. What's interesting is we don't know all the financial particulars, but she probably lost more money than she gained, which tells us that this was something that she just needed to do to recover. It was part of her recovery. And so when we go from that into the novel, that's where, and this is what novelists get to do when we don't have evidence otherwise. I think all these things were really connected. The wolves in her childhood, the fact that she had to be, she ended up paying off her mother's mortgage. She had to provide for an impoverished family. Her dad had already died. And then she had to create this successful career. She had to fight this man in court for 6 years. I think it's her strength, and all of it is all of one piece. And so I think she's one of those figures who can actually teach us about trauma, but also recovery from trauma, and about real strength in the long term.
Andromeda, would you do a short reading for us?
Yes, I think I'm going to make this real short, and I've spent quite a bit of time talking about Annie. And so I'm going to read you a very short reading, only 2 minutes. That's more from the perspective of Ruth.
I'm going to turn on video so that the audience can enjoy you fully. So I'll be back.
Okay. The deadline loomed as Ruth wrote about Annie in her 40s, beginning with the famous train accident in 1901, after which, anecdotally, Annie Oakley's hair turned bright white. Ruth had a dream one night of Annie standing alongside a train track next to a toppled, derailed car. She had aged overnight. She was ashen-faced, thin-lipped, haunted, staring, trying to tell Ruth something. You can't go forward without going back. Or was it, you can't go back without going forward? Maybe she had said both. It was all a blur, suffused with the smell of smoke and something sour, like urine, the product of animal panic, As far as Ruth could recall, she had never remembered a smell from a dream before. In the dream, Ruth felt she was doing something wrong, that she was disappointing Annie somehow, and that very disappointment seemed to make Annie fade, her outline blending with the rising smoke, even as she continued muttering something that Ruth couldn't hear. She tried to go toward her, stepping over the railroad tracks with great effort, and the sense of being held back, the motion syrupy and slow. She heard Annie speak again, even more faintly, from behind a veil of smoke or fog or simply time. Open the cabin door. Ruth woke up, heart pounding, trying to hold on to her memory of the dream, the feeling of frustrated movement and also guilt that she wasn't doing what Annie had begged her to do. Ruth didn't believe in ghosts, but she did believe that time itself, like many a historical script, bore faint traces and echoes of what had come before and been effaced. All our stories were like that, our passing joys and sorrows, just the latest scratch marks on the Mobius strip of time and space that must of necessity be endlessly recycled. We'll let Juliet come back. So Ruth was obsessed with Annie and clearly feeling like there's something she's doing wrong, something she's not paying attention to, perhaps in Annie's life, but also perhaps in her own life. And then I will say, I'll just be autobiographically naked. And clearly, as I was writing this book, I had to keep asking myself, in my own obsession with Annie Oakley, this new Annie Oakley story that I discovered, am I being faithful enough to the other stories that I'm clearly trying to tell, which honestly involve my own family as well?
Were you able to answer that?
Well, I think I mean, this is probably why there were so many different versions of the story. I mean, I think I had to develop characters that, again, you know what this is like, Juliet, that were not autobiographical,
Yeah.
but still allowed me to explore the issues and even the very painful moments that most haunt me.
Yeah. So this, I'm actually going to borrow this question from an audience member, but I think it's so good. But what was the original first draft of this book like? How did it differ?
Yeah, so the exact first draft was, it had the two storylines with some Annie parts, but were not as developed as here. But then it had a writer who herself was telling the Annie story. And this writer was also going on a road trip with her sister to go visit the father who was on his deathbed. And the writer herself was telling herself, unreliable narrator, telling herself she's only there to take care of her sister. But by the end of the story, you realize that she herself was on her own mission and was considering doing something dangerous.
Really very considerably different.
They're really, really different. Yes. And so this might confuse. So readers, don't go looking. There's no Mexico. There is no road trip. Thank goodness, because road trips can be deadly in novels. They can be really long.
But what there is in our new version, the most incongruous thing we can imagine is time travel. It's the secret of what makes this work so much. So I'm actually, I'm going to start fusing in some audience questions now.
Sure.
Really good ones. But this is one, you know, if we could talk about it without spoilers, but let's talk about the time travel element here, which will pose as the question of, can we change our present? Can we change our future? Can we change our past? But the listener would like to know if you did a deep dive into time travel rules, strategies, and science as you were writing this.
Definitely not into the science. Absolutely not. I was actually more interested in the cultural notions of time travel. And so I'm still not very well read in that, but I thought it was fascinating. H.G. Wells' time travel story. Oh, I should know the date, but I don't have it memorized. But it came out during the same time period. It came out during the same time period when Annie was at her most famous. Other things that were going on at this time. So we have the beginning, the standardization of time zones and the beginning of Greenwich Mean Time, and beginning of psychoanalysis, which might sound unrelated, but is related. And all these things had to do with anxiety about time, and as well as this notion of subjectivity in terms of like us having our own interiority that other people may never fully understand. that some of our interiority has to do with trauma at times, and that even our own sense of time is different person to person. All these ideas were being developed at the same time. So I was actually more interested in the sort of the psychology of time and some of those early time travel writings. But I didn't look to other time travel books to decide what my rules would be. I do have rules, and I do not have a time machine, but there are rules for the time travel in the book.
So one of which is that you are confined to your own life, your own lived experiences, right? So the follow-up question now is, if you personally, Andromeda, could go back in time in this way, what moment in your own life would you go to, and would you try to change anything?
Oh, that's you would think I would be ready for that one. If I had not written and read my own book, I would say, yes, I do have times, and it would be usually, it would be for the same reason as my main character. It would be to prevent harm.
Yeah.
But I think I'm now of the belief that messing with time is dangerous, which comes up in a lot of great time travel stories. But the whole question of, is it too dangerous, and is that really where should we be focused, is one of the themes of the book. Even if you're upset about predation or about harm, is that how we should be looking to change things, by looking at the past? That's one of the questions of the book.
And probably the one that is so resonant, right? It just gives you the chills about that choice to focus your energy on the past versus trying to change.
Yeah. Well, and and don't worry. I'm all of a sudden the subject that came to my mind was like American slavery. Don't worry, slavery in the conventional sense is not in my book. I didn't put everything in, but issues, say right now, of racism and slavery, those are the type of issues. And well, there's a famous time travel book written about African American slaves. But we in America right now are trying to figure out, what do we do now about those things that happened in the past, as well as what's happening right now with racism. But what do we do now to make up for that?
So another audience question, which you've covered a little bit of, but I'm not otherwise, I'll read the whole thing. You say you wrote 2 other books in the time it took for you to write this novel. Can you talk more about why you took those breaks and how that process affected this book? And I'm going to go ahead and tack on, what were the other 2 books?
Right. So I set this one aside, and then I wrote, oh, my math may be wrong, because actually I set this one aside, and then Detour. And then I wrote this one. And then the next one was Behave, which is the novel about the psychologist couple in the 1920s Baltimore. And then I wrote Plum Rains, which actually has 2 different historical timelines as well, a past and a present that interact.
I'm going to give everyone a visual aid so that they can know what else they should be reading after this.
Oh, look at her. Wow.
Yeah. So read all of these books. These are them. Okay. So go on.
But so I probably didn't make it clear, though, that I didn't set aside Annie the Wolf thinking, oh, I just need a little time away from it. I set it aside thinking it was a complete failure, and I was really happy to be done thinking about it. And so one thing I did right at the end of that process, in a fit of frustration, is I just thought, oh, maybe I should just have different characters, open it up a bunch of different ways. And so I wrote several different possible new starts to the book with different characters and different first scenes. And then I put those all away in a digital folder. And it was only after finishing Behave and Plum Rains, then I was looking for what will be my next book, because I'm always trying to pick between several different options. And I opened up this file, and it had this character, Ruth, and I knew the name Ruth, but in this version, she wasn't a writer, she was a historian, and she was late for a talk at a school. And all of a sudden, this teenager named Reece shows up, and they have some weird feelings between them that seem to be possibly supernatural. And that's where that little segment ended. And I'm telling you, Juliet, because it is still strange to me, I had no memory of writing that at all. Wow. I was like, where did Reece come from, and what the heck is going to happen? My amnesia is profound. And so I knew I had written it in my very last frustrated moment. And I could tell from the narration that the person who was writing that knew what was supposed to happen next, but I couldn't remember what was supposed to happen next. And so then I really did a full page 1 rewrite from there. I didn't just recycle.
So you maybe a future self who knew how the book was going to end traveled back in time to write that section to point you in the right direction. It all
I
comes
love
through.
that idea. I love that idea. And there's a symbol in that first chapter of a Mobius strip that's written on the teenager's wrist. And I have thought, would I ever go get that as a tattoo? As a sort of celebration of coming out the whole other side of the story, because writing this book really was the hardest. It's the hardest thing I've ever written. It's the most personal thing I've ever written. And it's really the first time I've ever published a book and really been willing to talk about the autobiography behind it.
Yeah. Okay, I'll go on with it. I do see, I remember you when we were working on Detour, I remembered you telling me about this book, right? And then you didn't deliver that. You delivered 2 other books. It also makes me wonder, but I won't ask you in front of these people what else you have in a drawer that I also want to read eventually.
Yeah, and I won't talk about now either, except to say that I do have other finished books, and maybe that, well, it might be of interest to readers or writers. I have full manuscripts that I set aside, and almost never because they were rejected by a publisher. Often I would have an agent's support or a sense that they could be published, but I could tell that they were not what they needed to be. Or the cultural moment wasn't right for them. And so I thought they'd come out into this void and it just wasn't right. And yet I still needed to get them to that stage. Now, I know we're talking about Annie and the Wolves, but I got to ask you a question or two, Juliet, or maybe just one. So we have both written novels that started out autobiographically, but then we had to really invent characters and really turn them into full novels. And we've also written about really difficult topics, including physical abuse, sexual abuse, and women having to live long and complicated lives through that, and hopefully end up with stories of resilience.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to ask you, because it was one of my favorite things about Stella Fortuna. You write so empathetically and well about women's sexual abuse.
Yeah.
Was that something you knew that you were going to tackle when you first started writing that book, or when did you feel able to bring that into the book?
That is so, I mean, and this is the really hard, it's the tiptoeing around. I think women at book events, female authors are often asked how much of this is real, and is it a question that's asked of male writers? I don't know, but the subtext is sort of like, did this happen to you? Do you have a right to tell this story? And in a way, I was very privileged because my book was shopped to publishers in November of 2017, and the Me Too movement was out. So I think there was a more, at least among many readers, there was a sense that we all have the right to tell this story because we're all part of this story. And it's okay for me to write fiction without having to spell out those connections, right? But at the same time, when I'd been working on the writing of it, I didn't have that sense of safety about it. And I knew what I wanted to write about was a woman who was profoundly affected by a sexual trauma in her past, and how it had these repercussions that had affected small changes in her life that had gone on to affect her children and her grandchildren. And I wanted to talk about, that effect of, bring this back to psychoanalysis here, when we're sitting in the therapist chair and we're telling, the therapist why it was our parents' fault, that in fact, the fault, it goes back. It's not, this is such a rich, if we don't talk about those traumas of our mothers, of our grandmothers, if we bury them, we don't understand ourselves. We don't understand where we came from. We can't move on, and we certainly can't protect ourselves from telegraphing this to the next generation, right? So I don't know. I felt like the whole time I was writing, it was like, is this too dark an experience for the reader? How can I make this experience more absorbable for the reader in a way that makes them feel included in it, and in a way that I'm acknowledging that they probably have a story like this close to their heart. And if it didn't happen to them, it happened to a family member. And I don't know. I don't think I'm done with that battle. I think the book has been published. It's been out for almost 2 years, and I still tangle with that. What about you?
A lot of what you said resonated with me in terms, and including the fact that while we were both writing our books, the culture was changing. And so this notion of people talking about it more, I think affected my story as well. I'm still continuing. The book is done, but I wrote an essay for Severance magazine about my own genealogy, because this person I've been referring to as my dad turns out was not my biological father after all. But he was Italian American, and this is getting into dangerous territory. He seemed to come from a family and a culture in which it may have been quite accepted.
Yeah.
This kind of abuse. And so I'm still learning about that. And so maybe that's something that readers would be interested to know. When we're done with our books, we're not completely done with our books. I'm done with this book, and I'm allowing it to be the reader's book. Readers can interpret it any way they like, and readers always have their own interpretations. But the questions in it, I'm still dealing with. And that includes the question of, like, is our revenge scenarios, fantasies healthy? And issues of bystander complicity, if we're, because I'm just as interested in that. Ruth is not a survivor in this story. I think I can say that she's not a survivor per se, but she is somebody who has witnessed and been close to things that she didn't do anything about. And she's surrounded, we can talk about the men in the story a little bit too. And you have this issue in your book. In this book, Frank Butler is a wonderful guy. And Ruth has a graduate school friend who's one of my characters dear to my heart. He's a good guy. But there are also men who are trying to be good, but they're still tiptoeing along and saying, let's not smear this person's name, and let's not look too closely into this, and don't worry, he's retiring, and we don't want to ruffle feathers. There's still some other men, some other people in the story who are not getting it, and therefore predation is still happening. Yeah. And so all those ideas are still in my mind about what we do in the real world about that.
Yeah. I've been reading My Dark Vanessa this week, and the issue of complicity. I don't know if you've read that. It's no. Very the issue of complicity there. Yeah, it is something that you can't get away from, because it's something I think we all respond to. It's like, what would I do in that situation? Would I be smart enough to know that something was wrong? And if I was smart enough, would I be brave enough to do something? Am I smart enough? Am I brave enough? How many times do we ask ourselves that question every day when we look at what other people do?
Would I recognize the signs? So what's not apparent from our conversation is there's some young people in this story. There's 2 teenagers who are real important in the story. When something is happening to a teenager, when their behavior changes, when they get suicidal, when they are not showing up at school, do you ask the right questions? Or do you just assume this is adolescence?
Yeah. Okay, we are almost out of time, and we have some more good questions in the box.
Oh, good.
Power through. Okay, let's see. Oh shoot.
I admire people who can handle the chat boxes and the.
Okay, so this one, I guess. Okay. You write so realistically about the physical ramifications of trauma and recovery. As someone with chronic pain and illness, I felt very seen in Ruth. I wanted to thank you for that. And also, I was wondering if you have experience with chronic pain, either in your life or in the life of someone you love. And if not, what did you do for research to write it so vividly?
Oh boy, whew, that's a good one. I do have chronic pain. I have chronic back pain, which I can't really sit for any amount of time whatsoever. So I do most of my work standing up. But interestingly, I didn't have that chronic pain when I started writing this novel. And this has happened a lot with my novels, where I've written in Plum Rains about an older woman at the end of her life with dementia. And I started that book before I had a mother going through that same experience. And so then when in real life I had the experience, as I was still finishing up that novel, I thought, okay, those parts seem real. So same thing here. When I started writing the story, the chronic pain issues were not in the book. They started entering into the book within the character of Ruth. And then I actually developed chronic pain issues after that, which is strange. But again, you brought up the tantalizing idea of somebody coming from the future and coming back. And I'm very sensitive to the chronic pain issue. And again, I think it's like a lot of these other issues where issues of being believed, of being understood, and how you can kind of go into your own different world because of the pain, and also because you feel isolated because the outside world doesn't understand what's happening.
So I have 2 more questions for you, and then we're going to end. The first one is Andromeda. In case there are attendees in the audience tonight who are already such devout fans of yours that they've already bought your book, but they still want to support this wonderful local independent bookstore, Skylark, do you have any book recommendations to share with them?
Okay, yes, we get to talk about books, which is always fun. I have three that I want to talk about, and we're going to get them done. And Juliet may have her own as well. Right now, I am reading. I've just started a memoir called "Unforgetting" by Roberto Lovato, and I'm not going to get the whole long subtitle right now, but it is about El Salvador, and I'm just starting it. But what interests me is that he is writing about his family's experiences and reportage. And he is combining something I tried to combine in my novel here, which is public history and personal history, and how those two intertwine. So that's Unforgetting. That's a relatively new book. Also for fans of historical fiction that does a lot of different things. One of my favorite books that I just kept telling everyone about by email this year is called Greenwood by Michael Christie. He's a British Columbia author, Canadian author. And if you haven't heard of this book, I think that may be one reason why. But if you're a fan of Richard Powers' Overstory or other books that are set in forests and have that ecosystem setting as part of the story, Greenwood is like that. So Greenwood has 4 different historical storylines. One of them is near future. And then there are these 3 different storylines, and it's intergenerational, and it also involves family secrets. It also involves a journal. I also love books that have journals, documents, suspicious documents in them. But so it gives you this incredible sprawl of people whose lives are all connected with the forest, connected with each other, with these family issues in an amazing setting. And then the third book I really want to talk about is one that isn't published yet, because it continues the conversation I'm having in my own mind about abuse and revenge. And that one is going to come out this fall, and it's called The Book of Timothy, and it's written by a woman, Joan Nockels Wilson, who is an Alaska writer. I used to live in Alaska for 20 years. Oh, she's here in the audience. That is, wow, fantastic, fantastic. And I got to read this book in ARC as an advanced reader copy. So this is a story of a woman whose brother was abused by a priest. And the author herself, who is a lawyer and a sister, travels from, with family is in Chicago. She travels to Rome to directly confront the priest who is responsible for the abuse, not only of her brother, but others as well. And I read this book after I'd finished mine. And so I was really curious, what happens in real life when somebody confronts an abuser? What do they say? Yeah. What happens next? And how does that person feel as they're processing their own anger? And is there any good that's going to come of this? So it's a fascinating memoir, and it comes out this fall.
Thank you. Excellent. And my very last question for you is, what are you working on now, Andromeda?
I'm working in the thriller realm right now. My next book is a thriller set in Guatemala. It's about a mother investigating the suspicious death of her daughter. And it involves some firsthand experience I had in Guatemala. And it was just, it's got some dark parts, but it also has some fun elements. It makes some commentary on creative writing itself. And because it's set in Guatemala, I'm actually going to be doing one more set of revisions on it soon, and it allows me to mentally travel, which is nice.
I think that I need to conclude. So can I just sign off by thanking the audience again and reminding everyone, please do support Skylark. Thank you for coming tonight. Love your local independent bookstore. They're here for you during these dark times, and you can care for them too. But Andromeda, thank you so much.
Thank you, Juliet. Thank you, Skylark.
Well,
Alex, thank you, everybody.
On behalf of Skylark, Andromeda and Juliet, thank you so much. This was an absolutely fascinating discussion. I love this. I'm sure everybody else loved this. And to all of you who attended, thank you so much. Everybody stay safe, stay healthy, and stay warm. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.